everyone, and welcome to this lecture for the programme of Literature and Humanities at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. My name is Steve Wharton and I'm your compere for this evening. This is a rather sad occasion in many respects, as it's the first meeting of the Literature and Humanities group since the sad passing of its convener, Dr. Robert Blackburn, a few weeks ago. Robert was a man who was passionate about the transformative power of education and the role that literature and humanities played within that. He himself made many contributions to the institution's programme through his playing and through the symposia he organised, most recently the Vienna Symposium. He was in many respects an incarnation of the epithet a scholar and a gentleman. We mourn his passing and we send our thoughts and best wishes to his widow Isabel and the family. Indeed, this lecture is dedicated to Robert and his memory. We discussed its content a little over a year ago during a splendid lunch hosted by him and Isabel at their home in Chippenham. Tonight's speaker, Diego Saglia, is a full professor of English at the University of Parma in Italy, where he is also Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Social Sciences and Cultural Industries. Having read modern languages at Parma as an undergraduate, his Erasmus year at Cardiff University persuaded him to return to Wales as an Italian language lector, alongside which he wrote his PhD thesis on Byron and Spain under the supervision of Professor Malcolm Kelsall. After 2 years at the University of Bath on completion of his PhD, he returned to Parma in 1998, but is a regular visitor to Bath and has contributed to the BRLSI programme on a number of occasions. The author of numerous articles and nigh on 20 books, his most recent hardback, published with Cambridge University Press in 2019, is called European Literatures in Britain, 1815 to 1832. This evening's talk, if you like, is flipping that telescope because he's going to be talking about European Romantic literature in translation, Figaro, Werther and Petrarch. He'll be speaking for around 40 minutes, after which there'll be time for questions. Just before I hand over to Diego and mute my mic and video, could I invite all participants in this evening's proceedings to keep their videos and mics off during the presentation. But at the end of Diego's talk, which will last about 40 minutes, please feel free to answer questions either by turning on your camera and raising your hand, or by using the raise hand feature in Zoom, or ask to speak in the chat. This video will be, this talk will be videoed and placed on the BRLSI YouTube channel in about 4 weeks' time. So anyone asking a question or turning on their mic to do so should also be aware of that in terms of whether or not they wish to appear in the recording. But without further ado, I hand over to this evening's speaker, Diego.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Andreas, also for organising this. And well, thank you, everyone who's connected here with us. I have to say that when, as Steve was saying, we talked about this talk over a year ago with Robert, well, I would never have imagined that it would have taken this particular shape. Yeah, we'll try to make the most of it, especially because, as Steve rightly said, this is really in memory of Robert and of his enthusiasm whenever it came to the humanities in a, let's say, in an interdisciplinary and in a comparative sense. Of course, his heart was in music, particularly, but not only. Art, literature, all the various sides of the human imagination and human creativity. So really an affectionate thought for Robert on my part as well. And of course, my love and affection also goes to Isabel. We'd not be here this evening without the two of them, and therefore I think I'd better live up to all of these thoughts and start and get cracking, because as Steve said, we've got about 40 minutes and then there is some time for questions. Now, again, the title of this talk is European Romantic Literature in English Translation, Figaro, Werther and Petrarch. So 3 characters, let's say, that are the figures around which I have constructed this talk. Now, here we go. I'd like to start with a few general remarks and then move on to these 3 figures and these 3 specific cases. So the talk is basically going to deal with the idea of international connections, contacts. I thought when we were talking about it with Robert that this was an absolutely appropriate subject to be presenting in a city like Bath and at an institution like BRLSI, thinking in particular of Bath and the institution's, I'd say, international, even transnational and cosmopolitan profiles. If you look at books like William Lowndes' They Came to Bath, or other similar publications, the people that came to Bath over the 18th and 19th centuries, and even more recently in the 20th century, many of them had this kind of international, transnational and cosmopolitan, let's say, makeup to their identities. Probably one that has come to my attention recently because of a conference I was at in Italy a few weeks ago was the Austrian novelist Stefan Zweig, who in 1934, having left Austria and the German-speaking lands, came to Britain, and after staying in London, came to Bath and got married here, and then left for the United States. Zweig is absolutely peculiar because he's one of those, let's say, double personalities, both very much based in his own linguistic tradition and cultural tradition, the Austrian German one, but at the same time, a major proponent of cultural as well as political cosmopolitanism at a very difficult time. So let's say I will be moving in this talk between the local, the international and the transnational, and I will be developing a series of thoughts and reflections about the problems, the obstacles, the challenges that these 3 dimensions pose. And also I will be trying to develop the 3 cases I'd like to talk about in the direction, let's say, of thinking cultural developments as transversal events. And also I'll be addressing the question of rethinking the notion of an island culture. I haven't called it insular, but I've decided to go for this formulation, addressing the question of what an island culture may mean in the Romantic period, in this phase between the 18th century and the 19th century. As Steve said, I will be taking ideas and developing ideas I've already written about in this book, which is the one he mentioned. And here are some of let's say, the general guidelines that the book follows and develops over a number of pages. So it's a book about the intersections of local and national concerns with international perspectives at a time such as the Romantic period, when there were 2 different lines of development. One was, let's say, the emergence of a very strong sense of a national cultural identity. At the same time, however, we had the increasing projection of Britain and the British Isles onto a global, let's say, global scale, onto a global panorama. And even as British literature was investing increasingly in, let's say, the national, the local, even the regional, there were other developments that concerned what I have called an increasingly close dialogue with foreign and particularly continental traditions, both past and present. So just a couple more words about what I mean by translation. Here, there are some, let's say, theoretical pointers about where I take my idea of translation. Translation as not just an operation, not just taking something from one language and moving it into another language, but translation as a place, as a site. I'm using the words of Emily Apter here, where she refers to this broad intellectual topography that is neither the property of a single nation, but it is rather a zone of critical engagement with difference. So questions such as fidelity, staying close to the original, respecting the original, become really secondary in this sense of translation as a space where meanings move and are in dialogue and are transformed. So it's a different idea of translation I'd like to talk about. Translation as, in particular, what we could call cultural translation, not just interlinguistic, going from one language to the other, but a whole cultural system to which a specific literary work belongs that gets transposed into another cultural system. And there you have a definition of cultural translation by the scholar Peter Burke from his book Cultural Hybridity of 2009. Lorna Hardwick also gives us another very interesting idea that cultures are actually created and defined by various kinds of translation. So translation as a little bit more than just interlinguistic transposition. Right, so the last idea, before we move on to my three cases, is that of appropriation. Appropriation, basic meaning is that of taking something over, of there's almost an aggressive aggressive sense to the word appropriation. I'd like to expand let's say the purview of this word, and again using Peter Burke, I'd like to consider it as a wide range of operations of cultural borrowing. That is to say, the not necessarily aggressive importation of an other cultural item, which the receiving cultural system proceeds to reinvent, redeploy, reconfigure, and transform and make its own. So in what I'm going to talk about, I will consider the possibilities opened up by appropriation, and not just appropriating other cultural items in the sense of depriving another culture in the perspective of, let's say, kind of a colonial imperializing operation. There is that. I'm not saying that that is not what appropriation is about, but in the cases I will be discussing, let's say that the productive, dialogic idea of appropriation will be much more evident. So now the three cases that are in my title, I've chosen them because they give me an opportunity of sharing with you three narratives that tell us a different story about Romantic period literature and culture in England and in the British Isles, different stories in which there are dialogues with foreign cultures, foreign literary traditions, present and past, and these dialogues, these conversations are formative experiences. These are familiar stories, the story of how Figaro arrived in England, or the fortunes of Petrarch, or let's say the Succès de Scandale of Goethe's Werther. They are familiar stories, but they have normally been seen as episodes, as single episodes, and they have not been really considered as part of a larger picture, of a thread, let's say, that gradually unspools in the field of English, British literature, and that then gets rewoven into a different pattern. So, having said that, I think I'd like to start with my first case, which is that of Figaro. And the arrival of the marriage of Figaro in England requires me to say a couple of things about Thomas Holcroft. This episode I'm talking about took place around 1784, 1785. Thomas Holcroft, and here he is, was a playwright, was a critic, was an intellectual, and he was politically a radical, a supporter of radicalism, and therefore a person who would become later on in the 1790s very much in favor of the ideas of the French Revolution. He was by formation a cosmopolitan in the Enlightenment sense of the word. He was an author of comedies, a successful one in the decade that we're interested in the 1780s. He'd made his name on stage, basically, as an author of comedies. And he was also someone who kept an eye on whatever was going on the other side of the Channel. And a strong background in the French language and French literature. Not only, but he was sort of very, very much a Francophile, kept an eye on what was going on in French literature, on the French stage, and at a certain point in 1784, he realizes that there's a new play that's garnering an enormous amount of success, and that's Le Mariage de Figaro ou La Folle Journée, by Beaumarchais. Finally, the play had found its way to the stage. The story of how it got to the stage is a little bit complicated. I'll gloss over it. But Holcroft said basically that they, in England too, they had to have this play. So in 1784, during the first run of the play at the Comédie Française, or the Théâtre Français it was called then, he travels to Paris, tries to get hold of a copy of the script, but it can't be had. It was just not available. And therefore, as it tells us in the preface to the published edition of The Follies of a Day or The Marriage of Figaro, he actually had to overcome a whole series of obstacles. It was a real adventure getting the script of this play, which he didn't get in the end. But what he did was that he went to the theatre in Paris evening after evening, and using his prodigious memory and the help of a French friend and collaborator, he memorized the entire play and the various entrances and exits and changes of scene and act, and then proceeded to transcribe it, and then brought it to England, translated it into English, and thanks to Harris, who was then the manager of Covent Garden, the play was, as we can see, translated, cast, copied, recopied, studied, and then it was performed on stage in, let's say, a record time. Now, this episode is absolutely fascinating because it tells you that translation is often not just taking a text and then sort of plonking it into another language, basically, to put it very, very bluntly. But there are people involved, there are channels, there are operations, there's traveling as well, there's going to another country, there's visiting another country's cultural institutions like the theatre. And then there are other people that mediate this translation. I'm doing this because I'm referring to cultural translation and not just interlinguistic. Here we've got the theatre manager, we've got the actors. In the end, Holcroft produced a certain kind of translation, which was the textual translation, but it was also the physical transposition, the carrying over of the text to physically to England. But then, of course, we've got the actors and actresses as well, and they also translated the Marriage of Figaro through their bodies and voices onto stage. Just to give you an idea of what the text looked like, this is the beginning of Act 1 in Holcroft's translation, and you can see that it's very minimal, very, very basic. If you compare it with the French is a little bit more expansive. I don't want to make too much of it. This is not the aspect of translation I'm really interested in here, but I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that also when we look at the two different, let's say, linguistic renditions of the same text, we have to take into consideration that when Holcroft produced this, he had a certain type of comedic tradition in mind, which was the English one, which was very different from the French one. And also he had a certain type of audience in mind. The London audiences at Covent Garden did not have the same kind of habits or training, if you like, in watching comedy. They did not have the same kind of expectations as the audience in Paris at the Comédie Française. Now, if we move on from comedy to tragedy, so if we change our register, I'd like to say something about another, let's say, phenomenon that happens in the same decade, that of the 1780s. So we're very much in the formative period of what we call Romanticism, or the romantic period culture and literature. Die Leiden des jungen Werthers, so the sorrows of young Werther, Goethe's phenomenally successful novel, first published in 1774, and both a great success and an enormous scandal right from the start. It's published in in German in 1774. It gradually arrives in England and in English, slowly but surely. And it's in the 1780s when the novel begins to attract attention among English readers and critics, and to cause a scandal. So it was first translated into English in 1779 via French. So a translation of a translation, you can imagine the result. And then it was, this same translation was republished in 1786 and 1789. It was again republished and retranslated, so the novel was again 1799, 1801, and so on, until 1809. This was, let's say, the most important period of the explosion of Werther mania in England. It was, of course, an unprecedented phenomenon. It became a phenomenon among young people. Young men started to dress like Werther. There were gadgets, there were objects inspired by Werther all over Europe, not just in England, but in France, in Italy, and in Germany, of course. And of course, there was a great scandal of the fact that the novel seemed to inspire a series of copycat suicides around Europe. In Leipzig, the novel was banned. In Milan, the Bishop of Milan ordered his underlings, let's say, to go and get all copies around the city of the novel around the city and burn them. In England, in 1784, the Gentleman's Magazine reported of the suicide of a Miss Glover from Southgate, and said that a copy of the book had been found under her pillow. And of course, this, let's say, increased the sense of scandal, and also, let's say, the moral reprehensibility of this pernicious work. Now, what happens is that The novel, yes, was translated into English, retranslated into English, but at the same time, this novel began to, let's say, inspire different types of translations, peculiar translations, such as rewritings. So there were authors who took inspiration from Werther, his story, and began to recreate the character of Werther, the tale of Werther. And one of these was Charlotte Turner Smith in her Elegiac Sonnets. This collection came out in 1784, the first version, because then she kept on adding more and more sonnets, and the collection continued to develop it continued to be expanded. The first edition of 1784 was an immediate success. It attracted a lot of attention. Smith was already a popular writer at the time, but thanks to these elegiac sonnets, she really became a bestseller. Elegiac Sonnets is another type of revolutionary work because it is a book where the author expresses feelings, emotions, sentiments in what appeared to her readers as very sort of free, genuine, straightforward ways. The poems, the sonnets were received by the readers as extremely direct manifestations of feelings from an extremely involved, let's say, female voice. It is an important book because it paves the way for romantic confessionalism, this opening up of one's own heart, which we associate so clearly with romantic period poetry. And then it's also an important book because it revives the fashion for the sonnet. And interestingly, it is a woman that does that. And for a long, long time, the sonnet was a form that was in the hands of female writers. In 1784, in the first, first edition of the Elegiac Sonnets, Charlotte Smith took over the voice of Werther. So at a certain point, we encounter, if we look at the list of contents, a series of sonnets, a cluster of sonnets, which are supposed to have been written by Werther himself. But of course, it's Charlotte Smith who reinterprets, appropriates and reinterprets the voice of Werther. This is an example. Go, cruel tyrant of the human breast, to other hearts thy burning arrows bear. Go where fond hope and fair illusion rest. Ah, why should love inhabit with despair? Like the poor maniac, I linger here, still haunt the scene where all my treasure lies, still seek for flowers where only thorns appear, and drink delicious poison from her eyes. Towards the deep gulf that opens on my sight, I hurry forward, passion's helpless slave, and scorning reason's mild and sober light, pursue the path that leads me to the grave. So round the flame the giddy insect flies, and causes the fatal fire by which it dies. Final exclamation marks. I should have read it a lot more forcefully, but this is an example of what in German literature would have been known as Sturm and Stress writings, Sturm und Drang. It's an extremely passionate expression of passion, love, disappointed love, and also the impossibility of resisting this vague de passion that the French would have called it, this kind of flood of passions. What Smith does here is quite extraordinary in this poem and in the other poems supposed to be written by Werther. A woman adopts a male voice. This is already something that's quite a challenge to conventions. But what's even more extraordinary is that she is adopting and recasting, refashioning a scandalous male voice, the voice of Werther, a character associated with suicide. which was a sin. So a voice, let's say, associated with the idea of perdition, with the loss of one's soul. This was something that was absolutely unthinkable, inconceivable. True enough, Charlotte Smith glosses over the question of suicide. I mean, there are references here and there, for instance, to the poppy, to poison, for instance, in this sonnet, but she's never really, let's say, straightforward when it comes to suicide. But at the same time, people would have known. You read the name Werther and you automatically know that you're talking about that character with that immoral profile that all the right-thinking critics in England and on the continent were denouncing at the time. This sonnet and the other Werther sonnets are potted collections of romantic themes. Love, despair, the insatiability of desire, passion versus reason, madness, insanity, the maniac, and this expression, hurry forward, which is a translation, adaptation, a cultural translation of the German romantic and Sturm und Drang idea of streben. That is to say, this attitude that forces the writer's soul to strive for something out of himself or herself, to aspire, to tend to something unknown. Now, not content with appropriating this foreign, very problematic but hugely popular voice, that of Goethe's Werther, Charlotte Smith, in the same collection of poetry, appropriates another foreign voice through translations which this time are more closely interlinguistic. And this time it's the voice of Petrarch. So after a section of poems, sonnets, supposed to have been written by Werther, there are translations from Petrarch, another little cluster inside her elegiac sonnets. So here you've got Petrarch, Francesco Petrarca, there you've got Charlotte Smith, looking the other way, but actually she should have been looking towards him. Petrarch, of course, as the great poet of the language of love, basically. He was the poet who refashioned the ancient idiom for writing about love coined by the Occitan troubadours, then reinvented by the school of the Dolce Stil Nuovo, by Dante and his other friends in 13th century Florence. And then, of course, Petrarch, that passes this language, this refashioned language of love, on to countless languages and countries and traditions in Europe from the Renaissance onwards. He is definitely a precursor of Romantic lyricism, and in the Romantic period in England, there was definitely a cult of Petrarch that was impelled by the cult of sentimentalism, the simultaneous cult of sentimentalism. Women were absolutely central to this rediscovery of Petrarch. One of them was Susanna Dobson, who translated a French work by a certain Abbé de Sade, The Life of Petrarch. And this was a fundamental book for the propagation of knowledge about Petrarch, but also for the creation of a mythology about Petrarch. The various editions of Susanna Dobson's translation of The Life of Petrarch into English were very often illustrated. And most of the illustrations regarded the sort of half legendary, half real meeting between Petrarch, represented as a kind of a medievalized figure, with his beloved Laura de Noves. Apparently, tradition says that Petrarch met this Provençal gentlewoman, Laura de Noves, who was the wife of the Count Hugh de Sade, who was an ancestor of the Marquis de Sade. Laura lived in Avignon at the time Petrarch worked in Avignon, where he held several clerical offices at the papal court. They met on Good Friday in 1327. He fell in love with her. She was married, of course. This impossible love inspired his creation of the Canzoniere, which is, as you know, divided into two sections, one written while Laura was still alive, the other section written after the death of Laura. The illustrations are very often about this fateful encounter, and they're very romanticized pictures. One of the sonnets translated by Charlotte Smith is one of the most popular of Petrarch's poems. It's Sonnet 14. Here you have the original Italian. I had to choose this one because it's one of those that's compulsory to be studied when you're at secondary school level, when you prepare your, when you study Italian literature. I won't read all of it, I'll just read the first 4 lines. Erano I capei d'oro a Laura sparsi che in 1000 dolci nodi gli avvolgea e il vago lume oltre misura ardea di quei begli occhi cor ne son si scarsi. You can find actors, Italian actors, reading it in Italian online if you go on YouTube, so I will spare you my bad rendition. I will instead inflict upon you my equally bad rendition of a few lines from Charlotte Smith's sonnet, Sonnet 14 from Petrarch. These two can be easily found online on the web. Loose to the wind her golden tresses streamed, forming bright waves with amorous zephyrs' sighs. And though averted now her charming eyes, then with warm love and melting pity beamed. Was I deceived? Ah, surely, nymph divine, that fine suffusion on thy cheek was love. What wonder then those beauteous tints should move, should fire this heart, this tender heart of mine. And so continues Charlotte Smith until she reaches the end of her very melodious rendition of a very melodious Italian poem. I would say that here it would be difficult to say that Italian is the perfect language for sonneteering. No, I'm not really sure. Charlotte Smith does something extremely, extremely skillful here. But I'd like to draw your attention to something else about this operation of translation. I said this is interlinguistic translation, more traditional translation. She takes the Italian, turns it into English, adapting it, of course, reworking it. But I'm not sure that this is all that we are in the presence of here. Think about it. Charlotte Smith takes a poem, Sonnet by Petrarch, where the woman, Laura, is the pivot, where Laura is in this kind of superior position. She's the idol of the poet. The male voice worships her from a distance, from a respectful distance. Yes, this is so, but in actual fact, the game is entirely in the hands of Petrarch. It is Petrarch who controls the language. It is Petrarch who fashions the metaphors and the similes and who plays with the sounds of the Italian language. Well, Charlotte Smith takes over that language too. In her version, Laura, the woman, is central. She is pivotal. She is a goddess. She's on the pedestal. But the voice that conjures her up is also, in Charlotte Smith's poem, that of a woman. A woman, yes, a woman, a female voice who is channeling Petrarch. But by doing that, she recasts him. She takes over his language, appropriates it, and completely reinvents it. So yes, this is from Petrarch, but it is not Petrarch. This is Charlotte Smith. So she keeps the content of the original, but she drastically rewrites the language, makes it her own. It is Petrarch, but up to a point. So, going back to what I was saying earlier, yes, this is a translation, but a very, very peculiar one, and not just one that simply takes one language and puts it into another. Now, from another point of view, Charlotte Smith deals with Petrarch in a mostly respectful way. If we want to find another treatment of Petrarch a little bit later on in the 19th century now, we have to go over to Lord Byron and Don Juan and the fifth canto of Don Juan, where Byron is slightly less respectful of Petrarch. And here in the opening of the fifth canto of Don Juan, he attacks all love poetry. When amatory poets sing their loves in liquid lines mellifluously bland, and pair their rhymes as Venus yokes her doves, they little think what mischief is in hand. So love poets create more trouble than anything else. And Petrarch himself, if judged with due severity, is the Platonic pimp of all posterity, he says. So basically, he's saying that Petrarch used to preach Platonic love, the worship of woman from a distance, and all sorts of idealistic nonsense. In fact, Petrarch's poetry, his idealization of love, has, for generations, for centuries, served lovers to reach their own ends, which are far from idealistic and very carnal, very, very physical. Now, with Byron, we've touched upon the so-called second generation of Romantic poets. And up until now, I've been talking about sort of early Romantic poets or writers or authors like Holcroft or Charlotte Smith. If we move on to the second generation, of course, there are countless examples of dialogues and conversations between English, British writers and foreign authors, past and present. Think of Byron and Dante, Keats and Boccaccio, Percy Shelley and Calderon de la Barca, Mary Shelley and Giovanni Villani, Felicia Hemans and Friedrich Schiller, Felicia Hemans, Letitia Landon and Madame de Stael. I could go on forever and ever and ever because let's say the panorama becomes so much more thickly populated. But then even this list, which could go on and on and on, would be a little bit unfair, because if we sort of move back to the first generation, there too, if we cast our mind back to the first generation, the cross-cultural dialogues between British authors and continental writers, again, is extremely intense. I've just given you a few examples, but yeah, we could just together maybe expand all of this for like more than just one measly slide. Mary Wollstonecraft and Rousseau, Coleridge and Schiller, William Blake and Emmanuel Swedenborg, Robert Southey and all of Spanish literature, Miguel de Cervantes, Luis de Góngora, The Story of the Cid, Walter Scott and Ludovico Ariosto, and so on. So to conclude, I hope I have given you a few ideas about the fact that, yes, it is good to think about Romantic period literature and culture as a great explosion of, let's say, homegrown talent. And in the 3 or 4 lines of introduction to this talk, for instance, we mentioned Jane Austen, we mentioned Walter Scott, I suppose that Wordsworth was mentioned in there as well, as examples, let's say, of sort of, I don't want to use a bad word, but like inward looking, sort of nationally centered writers. But there was all of this going on at exactly the same time. And sometimes even authors that we tend to think of as sort of nationally centered, they were very much open to what was coming from abroad. So to conclude, I'd like just to spend a few words about, yes, the inevitability of contaminations, cross-fertilizations, borrowings, comparisons, and exchanges. Romantic period literature is a mosaic of local and foreign suggestions, inspirations, admixtures. And someone who said this, and who actually declared the inevitability of all this, who said it really well, was Thomas de Quincey, the essayist and one of the great friends of the Lake poets. In an essay entitled John Paul Frederick Richter, famous German writer of the period, published in 1821, he tells a person who's asking him which German authors he should read. He says, I'll give you a list, and I'm very happy to do that because every national literature needs the influence of foreign literatures. And he uses the expressions, look, ingrafting, inoculation. So he uses the language of medicine, and he also uses the language of botany. But inoculation is very interesting because inoculation, it makes you think of one of our sort of keywords these days, a vaccine, which inoculates you against what he calls superannuation. If a national literature gets constantly, repeatedly inoculated with foreign ideas, foreign texts, then it has a good chance to avoid superannuation. That is to say, of withering away. Thomas de Quincey said it. He sort of explained the logic of what was going on. But as we've seen, well before 1821, we'd had at least 40 years, if not more, of this increased, intensified series of dialogues, exchanges, and inoculations and engraftings with foreign literatures, past and present. And this is also what Romantic period culture and literature was about. I will stop here. I've sort of overrun for about 4 or 5 minutes, and I apologize for that. And I'll leave it to Steve now to direct the Q&A.
Well, thank you, Diego. I don't think anybody feels that you've overrun. You've given us a very rich overview of the situation. Feats of memory, feats of personation, re-envisioning, reinterpretation, passion versus reason. But what comes out of all of it, I think, is the perennity of literature, and also the idea that no man is an island, and that Britain and Europe have a long-standing history of exchange, that we are not inward-looking, because if we remain inward-looking, then we are doomed to sterility. And I think that that's a very good summation of the interplay between literature, translation, and particularly Britain and the Romantics and Europe. Now I see that Duncan's camera is on, which I imagine that may mean that I will see a hand at some stage, but I don't know. Duncan, are you coiled like a coiled spring?
Written my question in chat.
You've written your question in chat. Very well. I shall look for it. One moment. All I can see at the moment is something from Andreas, and I can only see Andreas. I can't see your particular...
Well then, let me ask it then.
Please do.
Thank you very much for your talk. I admired its enthusiasm and its local vision, but I think you're being extremely unfair to Charlotte Smith. Why shouldn't somebody have the skill to translate Petrarch accurately, while at the same time taking into account the zeitgeist of Goethe's Werther and the associated melancholia? The very features that you would most admire in other poets, you seem to look upon as being some kind of a down on Charlotte Smith. Could you
Right. Okay. Oh, absolutely. Yes. Thank you for these remarks, because they give me an opportunity to reiterate what I was saying at the beginning. If I gave the impression that I was passing judgment on the outcome of the translation, then it was a false impression, and I didn't want to sort of carry that across at all. As I said at the beginning, in looking at these transpositions, no, I'm not interested in evaluating their degree of fidelity or not. That is to say, and I'll say it now, I think that Charlotte Smith did a wonderful job, because based on, let's say, the mentality of the period, what you call the zeitgeist of the period, also this huge interest in the theme of sensibility and extreme emotions, what she did was basically taking, and I'm thinking about Petrarch at the moment, so the more sort of direct translation, she took the Italian and then transposed it into terms which were both linguistic and cultural, that could speak to her readers. So accuracy is not really a word that I could use. I am not a believer in the possibility that translations can be accurate. Translations are approximations, obviously, and by approximating, what the translator does is making the text understandable, comprehensible. Basically, it helps, he or she helps the text communicate with the audience, with his or her audience. So frankly, yes, I must have given the wrong impression. I think that Charlotte Smith was extremely skilled as a translator within the parameters of the period and what was understood by translation at the period. She was very good at making Goethe and Petrarch relevant and communicative for her audiences. I think that she was very brave, because she took on a very complex and very dangerous work like Werther, and she also took on one, let's say, of the sacred cows of world literature at the time, Francis Petrarch. So I hope that this has slightly sort of adjusted what I was trying to say, and I hope I have corrected the false impression I may have given.
Thank you for that, Diego. I know that Jill Sutherland has a question, but before I bring her in, I think I'm going to bring in Jane Strachan, because I believe you may be able to continue the issue around Charlotte Moore.
Charlotte Moore?
Sorry, Charlotte, I'm giving her. Let me start again. Charlotte, yes, Charlotte Smith.
Charlotte Smith.
More Smiths, more Smith Moore. Jane, you're on mute at the moment. Jane, you're on mute. And then we'll go to Jill.
Hi, Steve. Thank you. Hi, Diego.
Hi,
thank you. So I've hijacked John Strachan's computer because I couldn't break my way into the Bruce Lee, even though I offered up my £5. And I want to hijack you, Diego, too, because I am teaching Charlotte Smith tomorrow, face-to-face, please, in Cardiff. And the one thing that I find when I teach Charlotte Smith is just actually how difficult her sonnets are to read aloud. And I wonder why that is. Is that an indication, or is it in any way related to her skill in translating or ventriloquizing Petrarch, or is it related to her weakness? Is it related to her self-expressivity, or to the lack of it, i.e., you know, that she is, after all, a literary pose to some degree, and a very clever and compelling one to boot. And it's just that as she was speaking, I thought, oh my gosh, you know, those sonnets are so difficult to read. I always find this. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that issue. And I love the cross-pollination slide, by the way, at the end, which is the substance of your talk, and I realise I'm skirting it a little bit. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts about reading Smith's sonnets, actually.
Yeah.
Sorry, Diego, before you come in, I noticed that Duncan's also raised his hand. I knowing that Jill is also in the conversation, I wouldn't want us to spend over long on this particular topic. But Diego briefly, then Duncan briefly, and then we'll move on to Jill's question.
Right, very briefly. Thanks, Jane, for the provocation. I have to say that, no, probably I haven't really had that experience with all of Smith's sonnets. I think that there are so many of them, and I think that she does different things stylistically in all of them. But going back, for instance, to this one, to the Petrarch ones, I think that these ones are particularly, a little bit more complicated to read and to get into. And my impression is that here she's trying to pack a lot of stuff into the sonnets. So both Petrarch's ideas and topois and images, and her own language, her own images, her own, let's say, weaponry in that sense. And also, there might be another problem, and we may want to think about this a little bit more at length and with more leisure. But she's using this, she's revamping this very compact form in order to cram into it shed loads of feelings, emotions, ideas, and this explosion of the passions. Maybe not in all the sonnets, but in many of them. So probably the means, the vehicle, is a bit too full of stuff that she's trying to put in there.
Thank you. Thanks, Diego. I just, as one of my students astutely said today, when we were reading the sonnet to Melancholy, it's so full of contradictions, she said. It's so full of contradictions, isn't it? Which absolutely is in agreement with everything you've said. Such a clever poet in many ways. Into it. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Diego. Duncan, do you want to come back in on any of that?
Yes, thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. And thank you also very much, contributors so far. I am still feeling that there is damned with faint praise here. Why shouldn't a poet be complicated? We could spend entire conferences construing Mallarmé, or trying to work out what on earth John Donne's talking about. But how dare a woman poet be complicated? Of course she's complicated.
Yes.
That's my
thank
question.
You. Yes. No, that's an interestingly polemical point. In fact, with what you were saying, what Jane was saying, what Diego was saying, I was imagining a future mini symposium, perhaps titled "In Defence of Charlotte Smith." Which I can see Duncan's putting his thumb up to. So Duncan, I'll maybe put you in touch with Jane later, and you, through maybe the Poet's Voice and the other poetry work, can bring that together. But we'll now move on to Jill's question, which takes us to a broader canvas. If you're happy for me to do so, Jill, I'll read it out. Hi, Diego. I wonder, do you know if any of the cross-cultural dialogues that occurred between Britain and more panoramic writers include any diasporic writers from further afield, i.e. beyond Europe?
Thank you, Jill. Thanks for that question. When I began to do the research, and when I started thinking about what I wanted to write on, I started looking at all possibilities, and frankly, yes, definitely. It's not just Europe, it's not just continental Europe. There has work has been done about, for instance, dialogues, these kinds of engagements, let's say, between British writers of this period and Indian or Chinese authors and texts. But there was a problem. That had partly been done before by other people working on what we call Orientalism and sort of Orientalist intersections. And also these connections were frequent, but not so frequent, as the connections with Europe. That is to say, the dialogues, the conversations, the exchanges with sort of living or dead authors from Europe, men, women, Spanish, German, Italian, whatever, French, they were so much more intense because, of course, sort of the cultural closeness was so much more intense. And also because I would say the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the post-Waterloo period brought Europe so much more together in so many ways. So yes, in this period, you start also having connections, contacts with writers beyond Europe. But partly it wasn't my field, partly there was so much more to say about the European dialogues. So that was why.
Okay, thank you, Diego. Before I call in our the BRLSI chair, Elizabeth Suchar, who I see has put her camera on, which presumably means she wishes to ask a question. Evening, Betty. Dilys Farrant has commented that Charlotte Smith doesn't appear in the Oxford Book of English Verse. Is that a sign of male chauvinism? I imagine it is. And Duncan is I think agreeing with me that it is not it is unfortunate the way in which she is omitted, and she is new to a lot of people. And I think, you know, I was only half joking about in defence of Charlotte Smith on another occasion. But over to Betty, please, Betty.
Welcome, Diego. Thank you.
Hi, Betty. Hello.
When you were pairing the poets of the second generation, you paired Mary Shelley with somebody I admit I don't know much about. And so I was going to ask you if you could elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah. That was a bit unfair. But I just I didn't want to repeat Dante too many times, because of course all of the poets of the second generation read Dante and rewrote Dante. So I should have written Byron and Dante, Percy Shelley and Dante, Mary Shelley and Dante. They were Dante obsessed, much more than the previous generation. So I thought, well, let's do something a little bit different. No, Giovanni Villani was a Florentine banker and chronicler. He lived in the 13th, 14th centuries. So he was sort of a contemporary of Dante. And he's famous, not just in Italian literature, but at a European level, because he wrote one of the best histories of Florence up until his time. He was a banker, but he was also a politician, and he was a protagonist of the history of Florence around Dante's time. And also his chronicle of Florence is an extremely good example of Italian prose from that period. Mary Shelley, together with Percy, read very widely books from Italian literature and all the periods, basically, not just the Middle Ages. She wrote an essay on Giovanni Villani, presenting him to English readers and sort of introducing this kind of figure who was not known to the vast majority. But in particular, what is fascinating is that she used Villani as a source of historical information for her novel Valperga, which is a historical novel set in late medieval Italy about the real historic figure of the, let's say, the condottiere Castruccio Castracani, who created a kind of mini empire, let's say, between Tuscany and the north of Italy. And she writes this very complicated, very historically accurate historical novel, which set at that time with fascinating female figures as well. Normally, well, we remember Mary Shelley for Frankenstein and maybe The Last Man. Valperga is another absolutely fascinating read. And she used her knowledge of Villani, for instance, to, let's say, boost its recreation of Italian history, Italian customs, Italian daily life, especially in the Tuscan area, for this novel. So that's why I thought, let's not just mention the usual people, the ones that we all know, but let's introduce an odd one out. And thanks for asking me. So you've given me the opportunity also to talk about Mary Shelley's Valperga.
Right.
Thank you. Before I call John Strachan in, Jill has just let us all know in the chat that she's learned about Incle and Jericho, the 1787 opera, which is a rather interesting piece of work, slightly out of the immediate sphere, but just one for people may wish to note in the chat. John, you have a question. John Strachan.
Where's John?
There he is.
Yes, I do.
Hi, John. Good to see you.
That was a wonderful paper.
Oh, thank you, John. Glad you liked it.
And can I really endorse what you said about Robert? It's a great loss, and what a man he was. Anyway, I just thought, on a kind of slightly flippant note, I thought you might want to know that the Arts Council, in their list of arts organisations sponsored in Bath, have awarded £189,000 to, quote, Jane Austen Bath Limited. So, isn't that good?
Okay.
Don't know how much brills he got. Anyway, did any of these people come to Bath? I mean, obviously, many of the German and French, Italian poets came to England, but I just wondered if any of them actually came to our city, and if so,
I'd like to do a little bit of work on that, but it might be, I have a vague idea that Madame de Staël might have come to Bath while she was in London in 1813. But that I need to confirm. Right. I was keeping that as a kind of a side type of research, maybe to plug it into sort of more local interests. Well, we have to say, as you very well know, that the heyday of Bath was in the 18th century, a little bit before our period. So I suppose that quite a few foreign authors might have come to Bath in the 1740s or 50s or 60s, all the way up to the 1770s. But if you have any idea if any of them came, then let me know, let us know.
I don't know of any. I know that Prince Pukla Muskau came to Bath,
yes.
and he actually spends most of his time saying that there's the only people who are here are old women, he says rather ungallantly. Because everyone of fashion now goes to Brighton in the wake of the king.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting question, isn't it?
It may have been that by the 1790s and then into the 19th century, Bath had fallen a little bit off the wayside from that point of view. So even if you had like a star writer coming to Britain, they would stop in maybe London and go to Brighton, or that area. Yeah, it could be. Yeah, thanks, John.
Yes, it reminds me a little of that guidebook description of abandoning the gentility of Bath for the Regency rough trade of Brighton. But but perhaps slightly off topic. Are there any more questions, either through visual manifestation or in the chat?
Indeed.
We would appear, I think, to be drawing to a gentle close, as it were. So if there are no more questions, I'll take this opportunity on behalf of BRLSI to thank you, Diego, for a fascinating talk. As you've seen from the questions that were asked and from the comments that have been made, as thought-provoking as ever, taking something that we think we understand and demonstrating that we all have a lot more to learn. And that's very much, I think, in tune with what Robert tried to do with the way in which he did literature and humanities. So it's a wonderful way to remember him. And on behalf of BRLSI, thank you very much for this evening's talk. Thank you to our audience. It only remains for me to say thank you very much. Do continue to support the institution through watching its online talks. And if Eventbrite does let you down, you're always very welcome to make a small donation via the BRLSI website. And with that, I'll close this evening's events. And thank you all to everybody, but especially to our speaker this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Stay safe.